In the years after the war, when ships lined the Hudson and the piers carried more freight than any place in the country, New York looked like the center of the world's trade. The docks did not look like a racket to the average person walking past Pier 40 or Pier 54. They looked like honest labor. Men with hooks slung on belts, men pushing crates, foremen barking orders, endless lines of cargo from the ships. But what people did not see were the lists, the shape-up boards, the names written in pencil and erased by noon. The men who waited every morning hoping someone picked them for the day's hours. That system built opportunity. Not dramatic, not violent. Just practical. A man who controlled the lists controlled the work. And a man who controlled the work controlled the money. They did not need guns. They did not need headlines. They just needed the people who decided who unloaded the ships. If you love stories about power, control, corruption, and quiet empires built in plain sight, make sure to follow, because this one ends where nobody expected it to. New York City, early 1950s. The waterfront then ran on muscle and routine. Ships pulled in before dawn. Cargo moved until dark. Longshoremen lined up in the cold, waiting for foremen to read names from a clipboard. You worked if you were called. You went home if you were not. That shape-up ritual was easy to exploit, and the first groups to recognize it were not the bosses inside the shipping offices. It was the men who stood closer to the street than the water. The ones who already moved gambling money, loan business, and labor payoffs across Manhattan and Brooklyn. The earliest influence came from men tied to Albert Anastasia, the old Brooklyn power whose reach touched the garment district, the docks, and the unions. He understood something about the waterfront that outsiders missed. The men unloading the ships wanted steady work. The shipping companies wanted no trouble. And the city inspectors wanted nothing to do with fights among longshore crews. That kind of vacuum always pulled in someone who preferred order. Old-timers still say the first handshake happened around Pier 50. A foreman with too many problems made a quiet deal with a man who said he could make the mornings run smoother. No reports, no notes. It's just a promise that the right names would be called and the wrong ones would not turn up again. By the mid-50s, the shape-ups had an unofficial overseer. And the man who would later turn that influence into a real system was Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo. Before he ever handled a union meeting or sat in on a sit-down, Corallo worked around the same industrial yards that fed the waterfront. Small jobs, mechanical work, fixing trucks, running parts between depots. He was not a showman. He was not the type who bragged about connections. The older guys say he was the kind of man who watched first and spoke later. That was the kind of temperament the waterfront needed. Someone who understood how work moved. Someone who knew the value of routine. Corallo's early years around those yards gave him a sense of the city's rhythm. He learned which foremen liked cash on Fridays. He learned which shipping lines ran tight schedules and which ones expected slowdowns. He learned how truckers talked about delays on the piers and how stevedores complained about assignments. None of this made him a boss at the time, but it made him something else, familiar. And in those years, familiar men gained trust faster than loud ones. By the late 50s, the International Longshoremen's Association, the ILA, had become a place where quiet influence meant more than official titles. The union had honest men, but it also had openings. The Genovese family saw it early and built their foothold through key representatives. Corallo, though Lucchese connected, worked the business side that fit the docks. The two families did not fight over it. They understood there was enough money to cooperate without noise. Some say the first deal between the two groups was done in a small restaurant near 10th Avenue, where three men met for lunch and left with a simple division of responsibilities. Others say it was decided in multiple meetings over the course of a year. The details differ. The result was the same. The waterfront became a place where lists were guided and manpower flowed exactly the way they wanted. By the next year, the shape-up boards changed. Not in what was written, in who stood next to them. The foreman still read the names, but there was always a man nearby who stood with his hands in his pockets, watching, not threatening. Not flashing anything, just watching. Longshoremen understood quickly. If you wanted steady hours, you stayed in line, you kept quiet, and you did not question why certain names were always near the front. It was an unspoken order, and unspoken orders last longer than written ones. The shipping companies benefited, even if they did not admit it out loud. Trouble dropped. Fights dropped. Work got done on time. If a crate went missing once in a while, nobody pressed the issue. Insurance covered it. And the missing crate often ended up in a warehouse 2 blocks away, where a man counted the contents and sent a percentage up the line. That was not fiction. That was documented in old testimony from longshore hearings in the early 60s. Corallo understood that control of the union meant control of the hours. Control of the hours meant control of the men. And control of the men meant steady income without risk. The shipping lines paid the union to avoid delays. The longshoremen paid the man who helped them get work. The foreman paid to avoid trouble. Every layer produced something, not much from each, but enough to build a machine. By the early 60s, the waterfront had its own quiet order. Tony Ducks was not the only man involved, but he was the one who kept the peace among the groups that had an interest in the piers. He had the temperament, calm, patient, not the type to blow up a deal. Men respected that, because on the docks you could not run a racket with anger. You needed routine, and Corallo understood routine better than most. The peak had not arrived yet, but the foundation had. The lists were set. The system had shape. The shipping companies were comfortable. The union leadership, some honest, some not, understood which direction the wind blew. And the men who unloaded the ships learned that there was someone behind the scenes who could keep them working if they played things right. That was the truth of the waterfront at its quiet beginning. The waterfront reached its real stride in the early 60s when the men on the piers finally understood that the lists were not changing by accident. A longshoreman named Pete from Red Hook once said the same thing everyone else thought. You want hours, you stand where they tell you. Nobody argued, because arguing meant you were moved to the back for a week, maybe 2, not because anyone threatened you. Just because the foreman didn't see your name. That was the kind of discipline that made the system work. Quiet, predictable, no paperwork, no noise. The shape-ups were no longer the sloppy morning scenes they had once been. The lines formed in better order. Men showed up early and waited without pushing. Foremen kept the boards under control. And behind it all were the men who collected the envelopes at the end of the week. Small envelopes at first. It's nothing dramatic. A few dollars from each crew. It's a small payment from each gang boss who wanted his men assigned to the better ships. It was never enough to get attention, but spread across a dozen piers. Then to dozen, then half the waterfront, it became real money. By the next year, the system had a rhythm that only a handful of men truly understood. Shipping companies wanted no stoppages. That was always the priority. A delay meant overtime. Overtime meant higher bills. Higher bills meant complaints from the national offices, and national offices did not like complaints. So if someone came around and said he could keep things smooth for a small consideration, most companies did not turn him away. They called it labor peace. They knew exactly what it meant. Tony Duck stayed in the background in those years. He never stood on the piers. He never handled the lists personally. That was not his way. He met with the right people in diners, in back rooms of small bars, in parking lots near the depots. He talked with the men who talked to the foreman. He kept the peace among the families that shared the waterfront. The Genovese had older claims. The Gambinos had truck routes. The Luccheses had business ties. There was no reason for a fight. Everyone earned if everything stayed steady. What Corallo brought to the waterfront was not force. It was the sense that he understood the work. Longshoremen trusted a man who knew what it meant to keep a shift running. Corallo had come up around men like them. Repair shops, supply yards, industrial corners of the city where people got paid on Fridays and never asked who handled the envelopes on Mondays. That familiarity mattered, because working men respond to someone who respects the rhythm of a job. By the mid-60s, the ILA leadership had settled into a pattern that people still talk about in old reports. Elections happened. Officers served. But the real influence ran through the men who controlled who got the steady positions. A steady position on the docks meant something. It meant food on the table. It meant rent paid. It meant you did not have to stand in the cold hoping your name got called. That security had value. And the men who guided those assignments collected a small piece of that value. The money did not look like a fortune in single payments. A few dollars here, a few dollars there. A dock boss contributing for the boys. A shipping foreman offering something to keep a busy week running smooth. A supervisor paying to avoid a slowdown during a rush shipment. But when all of that passed through the right hands, the total added up. Steady income. No heat. No headlines. A perfect racket in a world that already ran on daily labor. Some say the peak of that influence came around 1967. Others say it was earlier. Records differ. Testimony differs. But most of the older men agreed that by then, the piers were operating with a kind of calm efficiency that did not come from the union alone. Corallo worked mostly through trusted intermediaries. Men who did not raise their voices. Men who did not break things. Men who understood that the goal was to keep the ships moving and the envelopes circulating. By the next few years, the waterfront had become a place where outsiders could visit without seeing anything unusual. The cargo moved. The men worked. The supervisors supervised. But beneath that normal routine was a network built on relationships and small agreements. A supervisor got a better truck assignment. A longshoreman got steady hours. A foreman kept the peace on a shift that used to have problems. And every week, the right people climbed into the right cars with the right envelopes. The real peak arrived in the early 70s, when containerization started changing the industry. Ships carried larger loads. Work became more predictable. Automated cranes replaced some labor. The men feared layoffs, and fear created new openings. Influence on the docks became even more valuable. If you could guarantee a man hours in a shrinking field, he would stay loyal. And loyalty on the waterfront was currency. Corallo understood this shift better than most. He was not a modern man in the way the younger guys were, but he understood business. He saw that the change from loose cargo to containers meant fewer workers and tighter schedules. He used that to strengthen his influence, not weaken it. Men who once had steady work now depended on the people who managed the lists even more closely. Those people answered to him. The envelopes grew heavier during those years, not because corruption increased, but because the fear of losing work made men willing to do more to stay in good standing. Shipping companies still paid to avoid delays. Trucking companies paid to get priority. Even warehouse managers paid to ensure their cargo was unloaded first. Everyone contributed something, and the waterfront stayed steady. But nothing stays steady forever. The first sign of the decline came when federal hearings began to revisit the old longshore cases from the 50s. New investigators wanted to prove they understood what the previous ones had missed. They subpoenaed foremen. They questioned union officers. They studied pay patterns. And although the reports did not mention Corallo by name at first, his influence was no secret to the people who worked the piers. By the next year, the shipping companies began to change the way they operated. Corporate offices pushed for automation. New terminals in New Jersey cut into the New York trade. The days of hundreds of men unloading loose cargo dwindled. And with each year that the piers grew quieter, the system that had once run on routine started to thin. The decline had begun.